Behind Robert Redford's fame and golden smile is a life filled with heartbreak and tragedy. The man who wowed Hollywood with his talent and charisma had wounds that even success couldn't heal, from terrible personal losses to secret battles that shook his world. His story is a bittersweet tale of triumph and sorrow. Join us as we explore the tragic life of Robert Redford, a story so deeply sad it's hard to believe the early shadows. His father, Charles Redford, had been a milkman before becoming an accountant, and his mother, Martha Hart, worked hard to support her son's early dreams. In those formative years, no one could have imagined that young Robert would become an American film icon or that his life would be marked by such deep loss. However, there were signs from the start that the family's life would be complicated. They weren't wealthy, even though Robert's parents did have money. They did their best to give him a sense of normalcy. One thing that stayed the same was how much Martha believed in her son. She encouraged him to show off his skills on the baseball pitch and in school plays, and he later said that her unwavering support shaped his creativity. Unfortunately, Martha's desire to have a bigger family led to her death in 1955 when Robert was only 18. She had a blood disorder that developed after complications from pregnancy. This was a big blow to the teenager. Robert Redford's mother dying so young in his life. He later talked about regretting that he had taken her for granted and admitting that he was too young to fully appreciate all that she had done. The tragedy of his mother's death is just so sad, and it set the tone for the darker parts of his own story. In a way, his mother's untimely death became an emotional anchor for him, and he used that pain as fuel for his creative projects as an adult. Instead of the romantic idea of turning pain into art, it was more of a way for him to deal with his grief. His mother died just as he was becoming a man, robbing him of a maternal presence at a time when he might have needed it the most. People who knew him well remembered that loss planting a seed of doubt in life's fairness. He became wary of easy blessings, and this doubt showed up in his teenage behavior. Robert was physically gifted and a promising athlete, but he also became rebellious and experimented with small crimes like theft and dangerous hobbies like drag racing. His arrest for stolen jewelry made headlines in his hometown, but he later admitted that it wasn't widely known outside of that group. This event was a turning point that made him rethink the direction he was going in high school. He found a passion that would lead him to bigger stages, art. He could paint and sketch and make up whole worlds. His newfound dedication to art helped him deal with the emptiness he felt after Martha's death. For a moment, it seemed like art was his salvation, but he still needed a more concrete plan for his future. The University of Colorado offered him a sports scholarship because of his baseball skills. At first, it looked like he might become a star pitcher or at least find a stable way to get a degree. However, once he was free from the restrictions of his youth, Redford embraced the wild freedom of college. He joined the party crowd and drank too much, losing both his scholarship and his spot at the university. As a result, he had to drop out, which would have been humiliating and broken his spirit if he wasn't so determined. Instead, it pushed him to make another risky but ultimately life-changing choice. He moved to Europe and studied painting in Paris and other parts of the continent. This was a time of personal renewal, and the bohemian way of life sparked something in him When Robert Redford went abroad, he met many artists and freethinkers and gained a worldview that was much more complete than what he had experienced in California or Colorado. When he came back to the United States, he was determined to take a different path in life, so he switched his focus to acting and began studying at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. It was here that he would find stability and creativity. The specter of his mother's death and his own run-ins with the law still hung over him, reminding him that fate could be cruel. Auditioning was hard, rejections were common, but he showed a dogged tenacity driven by memories of what had been taken away from him as a child. This is where the story's seeds were planted, the heartbreak, regrets, and embers of tragedy that would continue to smolder in his life story, even though the world was soon to know him for his amazing movie roles and captivating charm on screen. The early shadows defined him in ways that he probably didn't fully understand himself. His success would seem glittering to outsiders, but on the inside, tragedy was always building. It's so sad to see how the first blow of losing Martha reverberated through the decades that followed. By the 1960s, Robert Redford was slowly finding his footing in the entertainment business. With roles on Broadway like Barefoot in the Park and Daisy Clover, he was showing off his range. The camera loved him for his all-American good looks, but he wanted more than just compliments. He was determined to show that behind those chiseled features lay real talent. But his quest for recognition would be overshadowed by reminders that no amount of success could shield him from sadness, just like the memory of his mother's death had stayed with him. In 1958, he married Lola van Wagenen, a young woman whose life became deeply intertwined with his. They got married with infamously just a few $100s between them, but they were young and hopeful, wanting to start a stable family life, while Robert's acting career was just getting started. Neither of them knew how quickly heartbreak would come their way when their first child, Scott, was born. They barely had enough money to pay the hospital bills, but they held out hope that their little boy would bring them joy. Sadly, Scott died just 10 weeks later, reportedly due to sudden infant death syndrome. Robert and Lola were devastated and struggling with grief at a time when they could hardly afford to live. Looking back, Redford would say it was one of the darkest times of his life. The tragedy of losing his infant son was made worse by the pain of his mother's death just a few years earlier. The couple tried to move on, but there was a feeling that fate could strike again at any time. In the wake of Scott's death, he focused more on his work because acting gave him a way to escape his own pain by living other people's lives instead of dwelling on his own. However, this meant that he didn't talk about his own grief in public. He said that he kept it private because he was afraid that admitting too much heartbreak would hurt his career. Back then, Hollywood wasn't as tolerant of weak acting, especially in men who were seen as strong leading men. So he hid the pain and let it come out only in private. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969, and The Sting in 1973. Fans fell in love with his cocky confidence, never realizing that he was going through a lot of personal pain. People in the entertainment business noticed how calm and dedicated he was on set, as if he was putting all of his attention on perfecting his craft. In reality, these roles were both a distraction and a way for him to support his family. He had 3 more children, Shauna, James, and Amy, giving him new reasons to hope, but tragedies related to his children's health problems continued to test his emotional strength. For example, James, who was born prematurely, had breathing problems caused by Holene membrane disease, a condition that was life-threatening in the late 1960s. He survived, but the family's worry never went away. In interviews years later, Robert said that every cough or fever brought back memories of losing Scott. Even though he was becoming famous around the world, he always felt like he could fall apart. This made his family feel unsafe. Lola was also deeply affected because she had to care for their kids while Robert's career took off. She did most of the work of being a mother by herself, especially when his filming schedule took him to faraway places for months at a time. Heartbreak in the Redford home didn't always come in the form of dramatic events. It came in the form of daily fears on nights when just a few seconds was lost, said Michael Filbert. When the kids were sick, Robert would sometimes call from a faraway movie set and hear the worry in Lola's voice. He couldn't do anything but reassure her, but this constant stress put a strain on both of them and led to marital problems. For years, they were able to keep up a united front, but over time, the unresolved problems left scars in their relationship that would never heal. After another wave of professional success with films like The Natural and Out of Africa, Robert and Lola's distance became too much for them to handle, and they divorced in 1985, ending a 20-year marriage. It's so sad that even their deepest love and best efforts were not enough to stop the constant sadness that was a part of their relationship. Despite the breakup, they stayed in touch through their children and worked hard to keep the family together. Years later, Redford would say that they both felt regret about their divorce and what might have been if tragedy hadn't happened so often and so often. As the world watched, Robert Redford was becoming a rising Hollywood star, co-starring with Paul Newman and earning critical acclaim and the attention of audiences all over the world. But behind the scenes, his personal life was anything but a fairy tale. The heartbreak at home never went away, and it got even worse when health problems in his family started up again. This time it was James who was in a life-or-death struggle as he grew older. Jaime had severe breathing problems as a child, but he seemed to get better as he got older. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis as a young adult, which was a chronic illness that caused him a lot of pain and limited his quality of life. As if that wasn't bad enough, complications eventually led to sclerosing cholangitis, a liver disease, and by the time he was in his early 30s, he needed a liver transplant, which was a medical drama that put his family back into a nightmare of hospital vigils. During the filming of the quiz show in 1994, Robert had to balance his directing duties in New York with frequent trips to Omaha to be with his daughter while she awaited transplant surgery. He was living a double life, as the confident director on set during the day and the worried father pacing the hospital hallways at night. It was a kind of stress that few people can imagine, as he was polished in public but torn apart in private. He rarely talked about this pain in public, but those close to him noticed a new level of reflection and a quiet fear that all too often Jim survived the surgery, and his recovery lifted the spirits of the whole Redford family. He would go on to follow in some of his father's footsteps by becoming a filmmaker and an environmental activist deeply committed to conservation and social causes. However, his health problems were never far behind, and he needed a second transplant to show how short-lived this respite could be. It was like Robert had been given a temporary peace, but it was a reminder that even the toughest obstacles counted for nothing compared to the enormous losses that were lingering just below. It's clear that his tragedy lies in the fact that these personal battles were going on behind all of the glittering success stories that were told about him. Throughout it all, Lola and Robert kept a good relationship because they loved their children so much. The heartbreak at home hadn't changed how much they respected each other, even if it meant the end of their marriage. Robert would privately thank Lola for keeping the family together through many medical crises, especially when he was away filming or promoting films. Even though they weren't married anymore, they still helped each other out. But the heartbreak at home wasn't just medical problems. Robert's daughter Shauna went through her own terrible trauma when her fiancé Sid Wells was killed in 1983. The case involving a flatmate named Thez Sma as the main suspect is still unclear, and even though investigations have been renewed in recent years, no one has been found guilty of Wells's murder. For decades, the crime's effects were felt throughout the family, adding another chapter of pain. Shauna was deeply in love and thought she would have a happy future. Instead, she had to deal with the darkness of an unresolved murder case, which would also weigh on her father's mind. Redford, who is naturally very private, was able to keep most of these problems out of the public eye, but he had to deal with the grief of losing his infant son Scott and seeing Jimmy struggle with her liver. As you look back on these parts of his life, it's clear that each new tragedy changed his view of the world and tainted his otherwise brilliant career. Fans were still waiting outside theaters to see the dashing star, even though they thought he didn't know much about suffering. During these years, Robert Redford built an image in Hollywood as a man of substance. He didn't look for roles that were heartless or meaningless. It's tempting to think that his personal life shaped his career. His struggles shaped the roles he chose, pushing him towards roles that required a lot of depth. Based on interviews and known facts, each heartbreak at home shaped him, building an inner strength that would show when he talked about life outside of acting. He never acted like a victim, and he went into detail about his losses. But his eyes carried a weight that fans and co-workers noticed. The sadness kept fueling his desire to invest in stories that had real human weight, like a father's. Even though Robert Redford had already been through more personal tragedies than most people do in their lifetime, fate was not done. In 2020, his son James died of liver cancer at the age of 58, which was another devastating blow to the family. After surviving multiple transplants and building a life as an environmental activist and filmmaker, Jaime seemed to embody the strength that made the Redford name famous. His death brought back all the pain that had been there before. Robert had been fighting for decades. In a statement to the press, Robert's publicist said that his family had asked for privacy and confirmed what those close to him already knew. He was devastated. The tragedy of Robert Redford is just so sad. Here was a father who had already lost an infant son when he was young and had to lose another child, even though he had prayed for decades that such a moment would never happen again. For many, it was a grim reminder that no amount of fame, money, or life experience can really protect a person from the brutal prison. In the days after Jaime's death, Robert pulled away from the public eye and went to his ranch in Utah, which had always been his safe haven, a place where he could get away from Hollywood's crazy energy and be in nature. His friends said he was quiet and introspective, thinking about how his life had been full of heartbreaks that never fully healed. The effect on his two remaining children, Shauna and Amy, was just as profound, with each of them dealing with the deep familial grief this father's worst nightmare. The nightmare wasn't just one event in Robert's life. It started with the death of baby Scott and continued with the near-fatal health scares that Jamie had from birth until this unimaginable loss. Behind each sorrow was the painful realization that he could not control fate as a father. For a man who had reached some of the highest points of artistic achievement, this feeling of helplessness became an emotional cross to bear. Jaime's friends and coworkers remembered him as a kind visionary. Robert Redford was an activist, filmmaker, and founder of the Redford Center, which focused on environmental storytelling and advocacy. His father had always been proud of his son's work to make the world a better place, but that pride clashed tragically with the sorrow of burying a child far too soon. The father-son bond had been tested before, but never so completely severed for Robert, who had once said that being a parent was both the most exciting and terrifying adventure of his life. Years earlier, Robert almost lost his daughter Shauna in a car accident near Salt Lake City. A bystander saw the crash and jumped into the icy river to save her, but she survived. The close call made Robert painfully aware of how quickly life can slip away. He tried to balance his life in Hollywood with his duties as a father, but tragedy kept following the family around like a cloud, bringing them repeated near misses, sudden traumas, and heartbreaking losses. Funerals have become a big part of Redford's story. Some say that these repeated sorrows gave him a gravitas on screen and an authenticity that can't be faked. But in real life, away from the cameras, the nightmare was personal and never-ending. He rarely talked about his grief in public, and when he did, he often talked about how important it was to cherish every moment with loved ones. If there was anything that could be learnt from these terrible events, it might have been that perspective. Even though he got a lot of praise, the real measure of a man was how he dealt with the many heartbreaks he faced. No father should have to bury a child, let alone two. But that dark reality became part of Robert Redford's journey. It made it clear that for all his fame and fortune, his life was full of tragedies that showed how vulnerable he really was. He wasn't just the golden inhaled lead in The Sting or the charismatic rebel in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Fame, there was a father going through unbearable pain and a friendship like no other. Robert's heartbreak wasn't just limited to his family. Redford also lost friends who were like family. Natalie Wood and Paul Newman were two of the most important. His friendship with Natalie Wood began in 1965 during Inside Daisy Clover. Wood was already a big star and Redford was just starting out. Their friendship helped each other in a business that often valued appearances over reality. When Wood drowned in mysterious circumstances, Redford was consoled. Robert's sudden death in 1981 made him think again about how fragile life can be. Equally deep was his friendship with Paul Newman, which he formed on the set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The chemistry that audiences loved reflected a real bond. They played pranks on each other and had a mischievous sense of humor, but beneath it all was mutual respect. After working together again on The Sting, the two became a legendary duo. When Newman died in 2008, Robert compared the loss to losing a brother. When a close friend who had helped him through personal and professional problems left, tragedy struck again and he had to fight grief under the greedy eyes of the paparazzi. Redford's relationship with fame was anything but simple. Because of his striking good looks, he was pigeonholed early in his career. For example, he missed out on the role of Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate because producers thought he was too good looking to seem believable awkward, even though he knew it was true. He got some chances because of how he looked, but he wanted to be known for his skills as his fame grew. As a result, he became more wary of media intrusions. The constant attention made every personal problem he tried to keep private worse. Filming on location gave him some relief, but paparazzi were often relentless. In 1980, he started directing regular people as a way to gain more control over how stories were told and to get away from the superficial parts of fame. This led to the creation of the Sundance Institute. In 1981 was another step towards independence. It helped independent filmmakers make films without the usual studio pressures, which reflected Redford's desire for authenticity. However, the glare of fame never went away completely. Interviews always came back to his looks, relationships, or painful family tragedies. The cost of this fame was high. It constantly invaded his privacy and eventually hurt his health. As he approaches 90, Redford feels the effects of the time he spent in his prime. Active pursuits like skiing, hiking, and other outdoor activities around his Utah ranch, but decades of physical and emotional stress have made him more reflective and at times visibly weary. He doesn't want to brag about his health problems, but friends have noticed that he walks more slowly and seems more reserved. Losing friends like Paul Newman and having many tragedies happen in his family have made his emotional problems worse. While there have been no major health scandals that have gotten a lot of attention, rumors about, he still cares about the environment and is involved with the Sundance Institute, though not as much as he used to be. The tragedy of Robert Redford's death is made even more tragic when we consider the pattern of heartbreak that has shaped his life. Despite this, he used his fame to champion what he believed in. Sundance opened doors for independent voices, and he continued to push for environmental protection, meaningful cinema, and charitable causes. People who knew him say he was quiet and determined and that he rarely wallowed in grief but never forgot how heavy it was. He has talked about valuing every moment, which is a lesson he learned from facing death many times. Even though he stopped acting and said The Old Man and the Gun, 2018, would be his last movie role, he never stopped working on films or in advocacy. In this way, the heartbreak in his life didn't defeat him. It made him stronger, adding depth to both his art and his mise. There is no easy way to end a life this sad, and he never pretended there was. He just kept going, a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. If his films were about adventure, optimism, or bravery, then his personal life was full of tragedy. But the two were always connected, which may be why his presence on screen was so powerful. Behind the famous smile and legendary roles was a man who knew all too well that every success, no matter how great, can be tainted by loss. Tell us what you think about Robert Redford's life and problems in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.